Okay, well, I'm glad to be here. My name is Anna Mance. I'm a professor at the law school. You're a couple faces I know and some new faces. So basically, I'm going to be talking about experiential classrooms, experiential education kind of broadly, and then give a bunch of examples of how I have tried to incorporate experiential learning into my own classroom, and then hopefully learn from you all also about things that you've done. So again, we're a liberal education institution, and a big part of that is getting students to think critically and in different ways, and experiential education can be a way that we do this. Some studies have shown that if you use experiential education, there are exam scores that go up by about 6%. So there are actual tangible increases. But also it gives students valuable hands-on learning. It helps students who learn in different ways to access material. And it's beneficial for employers who increasingly are looking for students to have actual like skills-based learning, not just book learning. Kind of as a side note, the bar exam, which is the thing I'm kind of most familiar with, but the bar exam is moving okay. Hello, how about now? Can you guys hear us in online? Yes, they can hear. Now, okay. Okay. They can hear again. Yes, for some reason it muted itself. So, okay. So as a couple folks here can see, my first prompt to everyone here is what experiential learning like means or evokes to you. Yes.
So I went through this really cool Episcopal school in North Carolina for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade.
Yeah.
And it was right in downtown Charlotte. And they taught us that the city was our extended classroom.
Yeah.
So we would walk to the library, and we would walk to the Performing Arts Center, we would walk to the museum. We were learning to think of all of those other places as extensions of our classroom.
Yeah.
So I've kept that mindset every city I've lived in. I've lived in New York for 12 years, through my high school, in like a ballet boarding school, and the Met Museum and the Guggenheim and St. Thomas Church and Lincoln Center, they all became extensions of what I was learning in the ballet studio. So that idea of a city as a classroom.
Yeah.
That's what I immediately think of.
Yeah. Okay, that's awesome.
Isn't that cool?
Yes. I mean, it's awesome that you had that experience.
I'm not saying. Yeah.
It's very like Montessori-esque.
Interact.
But
Yeah, on steroids.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, does experiential, I didn't get any of your names, but
I'm Silas.
Okay.
I'm Default.
Okay. Does experiential learning, just like the word, evoke anything or mean anything to you in particular?
In my classroom, probably it's less relatable to majors like dancing because I'm from math department.
Math, okay.
Yeah, so we have less experience.
Yeah.
And it's not physical.
Yeah,
it's not physical. So it's hard to say how we experience.
Yeah.
That. It's a mental game. So it's really different. And for experiential learning, well, I think I learned my English improved a lot since I came here to the United States, and I think that's the benefit of experiential learning.
Yeah,
I got to know what phrases and what sentences people use daily to, for example, greet each other.
Yeah, totally.
And to refer to each other. And that is different from what we learned from the textbooks.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, just using that kind of like, not study abroad, but if we were sending students overseas to learn a language or something, you're doing the reverse, but I think that's a lot of the context in which experiential learning comes up when we think about it. So I was just sort of like brainstorming ways in which like I felt like I experienced learning, and a lot of the classes that I had that I thought were experiential were really just like sort of not even immersion, but sort of immersion where you just went and sat outside, right? And you had class outside. And I sort of thought that was experiential because we're talking about trees or books and we're sitting in the grass. And so you're like experiencing the physical environment while you're talking about it. But I don't know if that is actually, I mean, it's maybe a form of experiential learning, but I think true experiential learning in the way that studies and researchers think about it is a little bit more than that. So I put up a couple examples here just to see if you thought that these were examples of experiential learning. And again, like I'm not coming from math or dance. It's going to be very different examples, but just everything from like a chemistry lab where you have to sort of iterate on a process and build off of like a tried and true process, and then come up with ideas on your own for what could the next experiment be. That's a form of experiential learning technically. Conducting class outside under a tree, I think there's benefits to that, but I don't know if it has the like self-reflection that experiential learning really requires. Negotiation exercises and simulations, walking and talking and engaging, touring, like doing things that are like putting you out into the world. I think these are all on a surface level potentials for experiential learning, but I think you need to do a little bit more in order to make the experience translate into something a little more substantive. So this is from the Association for Experiential Education, and there are a bunch of studies that sort of draw on different aspects of what experiential learning is, but these are some of the kind of principles or focuses that experiential learning wants to emphasize. So it's on the process, not the product, right? It's on developing problem solving and critical thinking rather than any particular outcome, and definitely not memorization, which is so much of what we do, maybe in math also. But you're memorizing maybe like certain things that like certain structures, but you're not memorizing the outcome. Maybe you memorize 2 + 2s, or but you're really asking them to like think critically about how the structure of math works so that they can solve problems beyond the one they've memorized. It's semi-structured, it's usually engaged in the real world in some way. And the key thing is this cycle of doing reflection and synthesis, which I think elevates sitting and talking under a tree into something that has more tangible benefits. So you're doing something, you're sitting under a tree, but then you have to go and like reflect on what was the purpose or what was the process or what was the benefit that I got from that experience. And then synthesize that. What did I expect to happen with what actually did happen? What can I learn from that process, and how can I use that going forward to develop my thinking about next topic? Again, it's not just learning by doing or hands-on learning. It's not just like, doing the chemistry experiment to like put item A into the beaker and item B and see what happens. It's the reflection that happens following that. It's non-hierarchical, and the instructor is really more of a facilitator than a director. These are common examples, as I was saying earlier, of what experiential learning in higher education. A lot of it is geared towards like K through 12, like you were mentioning. So there's a lot of research at the lower level. And then when you get to higher education, you see like actual externships and internships where you're going outside of the university. Maybe field work is sort of associated with your major in some way, but you're really going out to do work somewhere else. So the thing that I wanted to focus on for today was how can we bring experiential learning in more like discrete ways or smaller ways into the classroom versus I don't know, maybe you're sending students out to do, like, I don't know what your equivalent to field work is, but, or for math either. But what could you do on a Tuesday during your class or, and all that. So here are maybe 10 like elements or principles that I think we can adapt to the classroom. These you could use in a variety of different ways, but I'm going to run through each of the top 9 of these kind of quickly. One, and you'll see all my notes up there, so maybe I don't even need to repeat this. But I really loved this, this idea of framing, creating meaning. Too much gum or teaching makes it hard to chew or experience. So if you spend all of your time lecturing, the students don't have enough time to actually do anything hands-on with what you've lectured. They can't take the material and then translate that for themselves into something. The same thing with underframing. I was just like, what's the thinnest piece of gum I can find versus like the biggest wad of gum I can pick up? And I was like, I don't know, double my gum. So you chew a piece of gum, it's gone in a second. You're like, why did I even have this exercise? What was the point of class today? It's sort of like directionless. So I think like a couple things that I've tried to do are give pre-lectures, and I think some other people do this where they record lectures in advance that gives the basic, here are the key things you need to know for today. It's kind of the drier stuff. Students listen to that in advance, and then when you actually get into class, you can spend more of your time doing exercises. And again, this is, if you're more time limited, that's a good way to be able to free up time for actually doing exercises. I do negotiation exercises where students get materials in advance that they have to prepare. They're given a set of boundaries and limitations that they have to kind of work under, so a set of constraints. And then they're not told how to use the material, they're just told, this is your objective, and you need to like know what you are willing to accept and what you absolutely cannot accept. So just kind of like the baseline negotiation principles. And then here's a bunch of materials. You're going to be negotiating with one or several other parties. You can use those as you wish, as you see fit. And then it really leaves the students a lot of opportunity for creativity and thinking about how they best want to use the material within these set of constraints. And I think that's a really good example of what experiential education aims to do in terms of avoiding over or under framing. Let's see, I think those are some of the key things. So, and again, in the negotiation example, what I'm really focusing on is the advocacy part of it. It's not really about, did you learn the materials? It could be on anything. It's what is the process of a negotiation? What are the limitations that you know are going to be present in any similar scenario to this? The material will change, but the inputs will change, but the kind of general structure of it will always be the same. So framing the experience so that you give students enough information to work with, but not too much and not too little that they're like, I don't even know what I'm doing here. The second, designing for student agency. As we know, students really attach to things that they're passionate about rather than being told to do X, Y, or Z. So again, resist the urge, as I put here, to prepackage. I worked hard trying to make that work. Instead of, giving them like, here's a box of things, here it's all set up, now you just go work through the steps. Instead, I think you should like draw on what students are interested in, ask them to kind of like work, within again a slim set of parameters. Go out and explore and see what you can do. So I had this example from my own undergraduate. I took a history course and we were given this research assignment to go out and research some site on campus that had something to do with the civil rights movement or the Vietnam era. So I picked the humanities building. This is at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. This is the humanities building. And there's a lot of lore that surrounds this building. It was built in 1966, completed in 1969. And the building was built just after the physics building had been blown up by some activists. Somebody died in the incident and it was a big thing. So this building was built shortly after. And so there are rumors that it was built to be riot proof or bomb proof. So because it's very modular when you get inside. So the hallways are narrow, you can't connect with people. So it eliminates the possibility for people to unite in any given area. There are a bunch of other rumors around the building in terms of why it was constructed. It turns out a lot of them appear not to be true, and it was just an example of brutalist architecture. But the fact that I got to go and like research this building and the architecture of it, the history of it, what it meant on campus, there's all sorts of really interesting features at the University of Wisconsin also related to the kind of protest era in the 60s and 70s. So really other students picked other examples that they were able to find, and we had this really fascinating like underground UW-Madison kind of final class. So again, ask students to respond to what they find compelling in a given topic. What do they think is most pressing? Align experiences with learning outcomes. Again, really, it's important to set clear goals and intentions. Directionless learning is really unhelpful for everyone. It's frustrating for the teacher. It's frustrating for the students. And especially, I know everyone hates random activities just for the sake of doing something. So an important way to engage is to find some kind of community partner. And sometimes this can be like as easy as like, are you looking for a project that our students can do? Maybe you don't even really need a deliverable, but at least maybe you have a program that I can model a class project around, and then we can present to you, and you can get somebody on Zoom, or you can actually have them come in. So the students feel like if the institution or the place doesn't actually need a deliverable, at least you can simulate a real life deliverable. So something that I have been working on is I take my students to the Audubon Center every year because there's a really fascinating history about the origin of the center that comes from years of the environment being used as a toxic waste dump. And there's a community who lived nearby. They still do live nearby, but there were adverse health impacts on this primarily Black community. So the city of Dallas is really involved. There was a lawsuit that engaged both the person who was running the dump illegally, but also the city that was using the area as a way to dump some of the city waste, maybe or maybe not knowing that it was illegally licensed, or willful blindness for a period of time. So I haven't done this yet, but I hope to, at some point in the future, partner with them to design some kind of educational history around that environmental history and legal history that underpins what the Audubon Society does. And again, you can use that practice or that deliverable, that experience to reinforce certain learning outcomes. And I list a couple of them up there, but who's your audience? Thinking about that. What is culturally relevant? What is culturally sensitive for the needs of both the institution or the entity that you're designing for? And then who might come and actually take it in? So who's the educational audience? And then that helps students to kind of understand what their strengths are as an agent of change in an educational setting, because that's what it primarily is at this point. So again, that just makes the work that you're doing feel more real, feel purposeful. Incorporate substantive reflection. I think things become more meaningful, and this really goes to the reflection piece of the experiential learning. things become more meaningful as you iterate on them and reflect on them. And this doesn't mean write me a journal entry. I think we all had those assigned to us at some point, like write a journal about how you're feeling or like what you're learning over the course of a month or something. And it's just like sometimes it's super rambly. So what you want is not just like the rambling, but reflection, substantive reflection that asks you to think about things in an either written way, could be visual. It really depends on what your subject is and discipline. It could be a narrative, interpersonal, etc. That I think really asks for the students to demand more of themselves in reflecting rather than just like, I did this today. I like to assign something at the beginning of class on a controversial book or essay, and then I ask students to write a reflection, and I give them really strict guidelines of what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for thoughtfulness, I'm looking for good grammar, I don't care what your perspective is, I hope that you share diverse perspectives, and I hope we get a bunch of different angles coming into the classroom. But if I read this and I feel like you didn't put any thought into it, that's where you will be dinged. And I think it really has provided fodder for really interesting class discussions following that. So we talk about the reflections in class after that, but I think, again, incorporating substantive reflection in whatever way that is, whether it's through writing, whether it's through creating a video or some other form, or I don't know, interpretive dance. I don't know what that would be. Math, I'm really struggling with. Math is but I'm sure there are ways to have students reflect on the process that they had to go through in order to reach an answer. Again, designing for relevance. Make it matter to somebody else beyond just me or you or even your peers. A lot of our academic work is done in private, like test taking or writing an essay or writing a paper. That's done sitting alone in the comfort of your own home or at the library or something, and nobody reads it except maybe your instructor. So make your assignment, make your work matter to somebody else, make it a public act. So even requiring them to do a formal presentation, I sometimes recommend that they do TED Talks, and I make them watch different TED Talks to give them examples. Again, if you can bring somebody from the outside in to observe, that always ups the ante and makes them engage a little bit more because there's more of an audience that they're not comfortable with and they want to perform better. Also, public speaking is always a great skill to be incorporating into the classroom in whatever way you can. So teamwork, communication, public speaking are, I think, important skills that employers especially want to see. If a student has a recorded like TED Talk that they did in a class, that's something they can use going forward. And I think that's very empowering also. So again, design for relevance and application and meaning. Allow for uncertainty and ambiguity in the learning process. Again, so much of learning comes from just like not having any idea what's going to happen. As an instructor, that's very fearful because you don't know if you're going to get to the end of class and be like, I don't know what we did for the last hour. This is the Great British Bake Off, a picture. And you know how they have like the mystery ingredient where they're like, use mushroom sauce or something, and the people are like, I don't even know what that is. Like, and then they have to come up with something sort of creatively on the fly. I think this is sort of what you're aiming for here, rather than just giving them a recipe and saying, follow that. And again, in math, like, I would love to hear your thoughts on like, here's the tried and true. This is what people are looking for. This is what they're going to expect, right? In the real world, we want to provide people with nice looking vanilla cakes most often, but then everybody just only ever makes vanilla cakes, right? So when you give them weird ingredients to use and you force them to like sort of think outside the box and have to be like, okay, I only have like 6 ingredients in front of me. What can I do with this? You just get like an entirely different kind of product, and different people make different things. And I think all of that is great and okay. So again, there's the example here of an engineering faculty member that I read about who had this kind of like cookbook style. So like, here's a bunch of ingredients and then you follow them in order to get to the end result that we're sort of looking for. So giving you instructions for how to get there. He kind of flipped it and just said, here's a bunch of stuff that we generally use as engineers, and let's make a building. How do we do that? There's no rules, there's no anything. So maybe we make a teepee and that's like all we can come up with. And maybe somebody comes up with some like crazy new structure, and maybe somebody actually makes the actual vanilla cake that you were supposed to make. But again, it just incorporates more learning. It forces students to think in different ways rather than just rely on the recipe that they're given. I often give students assignments whereby I recently gave them a public comment to write to submit to the government. And there's a formula that's sort of like the ideal formula for writing a public comment. You write the formal letter and you start by introducing yourself, and then you say, here are you front load the things that you're asking for, and then you write some pros and some cons, and then you conclude. And I want students to get to that eventually, but I want to see what their creative ideas are first. So first I just say like, write a public comment without giving them examples, just to see what they come up with and what kind of structure they think is appropriate. And then from that starting point, I guide them towards, here is like the ideal of what you want to get to, but I don't want to start with that point because then they think that's the only way to do it. Okay, learning alongside your students. Again, the non-hierarchical feature of this, it's not an expert-driven methodology. I think modeling learning is really important. I like to model asking questions, but also like modeling curiosity about a given topic. So whatever you can do to avoid being the expert, I think really helps students come out of their shells and be able to assume the role of expert themselves. So you, of course, are your subject matter expert, but I think it's helpful to take yourself out of the classroom for these kinds of things, because it's hard to be in a classroom and not be the expert. I think there are a lot of potential pitfalls here, like your students not seeing you as competent in a given area. If you're saying like, I don't know the answer. I think that's especially a concern for younger faculty members, newer faculty members, and women especially. So you don't want to lose credibility with your students. So a way that I've thought about doing this is next week, or actually in a couple of weeks, we'll be going to the Busch Garden. It's a place that I have been to. I know a couple things about it, but I don't know the history or like a lot of the details about the center. So I'll be asking the students to do their own research and come up with one thing to contribute, one very substantive thing, not just like there are flowers there, but something very substantive that would require them to do some research. And then we'll go there, walk around, and people can point out the different features. And I can claim ignorance and not feel like I'm giving up my own credibility, but also I don't have to be the expert, and I can have them teach me, and then I can model what it's like to be a curious student and an engaged student in that process.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
First of all, now I want to go to law school.
Yeah.
How do you then parlay this into the law? How does this fit into your class?
Yeah, so my class is an environmental law class.
I see.
Yeah, so it makes sense that I'm doing all these nature-based. Yeah. So one of the discussion questions that I hope we can talk about is, I also teach a big lecture class in civil procedure, which is very rule-oriented. And it's not, I mean, we could go to a courtroom and like students can do internships and that kind of, but in a class of 60 or 80 students, I think it's much harder if you can't do field trips.
Yeah.
I think it becomes much harder in a lecture setting. So something I do want to talk about is what are the limitations. But for my environmental law class, because it's more like subject oriented, it's easier to be going to the Audubon Center. And I've taught other classes where I try to find, what's the relevant place in the city that connects to this class, and then take the students there, bring people in so that they can sort of engage in the material in a more like concrete way.
How big is this class?
This class right now is 12 people.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So it's a really good size for field trips and like being on excursions without getting kind of out of hand.
And people feeling healthy pressure to contribute something substantive.
Yeah, exactly. They can't hide. They can't hide in the crowd. There's not that many of them. Exactly. Oh. Okay, work with students holistically. I mean, I don't know if there's much to say about this beyond like try to move away from just the intellectual exercise of learning into how does this make you feel? What's your psychological reaction? When I do those self-reflection exercises or like read this book and then write a reflection on how did you digest this? Did it make you angry? Can we be critical about this? What do you like? What do you not like? I really am asking them to do more of the psychological, social, and emotional learning than just like critiquing the author for the quality of his research, for instance. And I think the discussions we develop from that focus more. They do get to the intellectual aspects of it, but it's drawn from the students' kind of like internal empathy and emotional reactions. There are other, I think, like ways that you can do this, but a lot of them involve like going out into the community. Also, feedback and working holistically with a student is, as you know, very time consuming. And so if you're an advisor and you just have a few students, that's fine. If you're in a bigger class, even 12 students becomes a lot of work to be engaging one-on-one with students constantly throughout the class. So again, I think there are limits on what is possible in certain settings, but I think obviously if you have the capacity and the time to do this, there's a lot of really beneficial knowledge and learning that can result. Okay, finally, be flexible and appreciate the serendipity of the whole process. I think it's really important to plan and practice the lecture that you want to give or design the class that you want to give. But if things just like go awry, just be okay with that happening and develop the skills of being able to like pivot and adapt yourself. A lot of learning comes in ways that we never expect, in places that we wouldn't have expected. So I think just remaining open to that and not so fixed on the rigidity of what we think will make a class good. I think taking cues from your students, if everyone's falling asleep, like clearly something isn't working. So it doesn't mean that you're not performing or something like that, but maybe you need to just like ask people to get up and stretch and like re-engage in a different way or ask questions in a different way or think about like maybe the structure in which I teach just doesn't work for this group of people and how can I engage them in different ways. Okay, finally, just, like practice these again. I think the point of this slide is to be thinking about including DEI in all of this. So when you're structuring a class or some kind of exercise or simulation or field trip or whatever it may be, who is going to be, if we're kind of interacting with somebody else or even among the various students, who's going to be most impacted by this, in what ways, who has voice in the design. So this is sort of speaking very broadly, but just, what are the values and the relationships that you're trying to cultivate? I think that should play a big part in all of the different exercises that you create, not just in the outputs that the students generate, but the actual process of you guiding them through this. Okay, so this is just a kind of a learning synthesis, create or provide some kind of concrete experience with an uncertain outcome, I think is where you want to start. So you don't know exactly where you're going to get. I have no idea what my students are going to come up with when we go to the Busch Garden. But I know that they will come up with something. Reflective observation. So reflecting, asking them to reflect then on like what was beneficial or not beneficial about this. What did you learn? And what did you learn from the process of having to do the work? What did you learn from your classmates? Finally, synthesis. That's what did you think you were going to learn? Or what did you think this would be like? And how did what actually happened change or align with what you thought would happen? And again, I think these are the two keys of making experiential learning a little more transcendent versus just being outside on a visit to the garden. And then take the synthesis and try to come up with new questions or new experiments or new ways of thinking about whatever the general topic was we were thinking about. So when we go to the Busch Garden, we'll be talking about ecology and water pollution. There are some, I know that at least there are some design structures that were made to address certain water features and like the actual like ecology of the place is really tied to some of the limits, like pollution related limits. So my goal is to eventually get to that tie-in with the whole class that we're doing. But what did the people who went out and constructed that garden have to think about, and how can that relate to how students think about whether or not our laws are effective or ineffective? Okay, how can we do this in the classroom? So I gave you a bunch of examples that are like semi-classroom, near class related. I think just the 4 steps of like, it really takes a lot of work to plan, I think, and prepare materials for a more experiential exercise. So whether that's developing materials for a simulation, which I find to be super engaging, or case studies that you can do in class. Anything that really simulates what happens in the real world, I think students are drawn to, or assignments that relate to developing or creating something. The process of coming up with whatever the deliverable or the final product is, all the steps that you have to go through and the learning that you go through to get there is beneficial. But again, being really clear about what you're ultimately hoping the students get to, and then giving them enough guidelines and boundaries to work within, or constraints rather, and then a couple goals that they should be aiming for. Finally, there's probably some materials you have to prepare. There's a ton of resources I have found, at least in my field. People have come up with case studies and simulations that are online. If you can't think of something yourself, there's probably something to get you started. But as I now see sort of the structure, I've started to develop some of my own ideas for what I can do. Facilitate, give them enough structure, as I was saying, and an objective, right? They need to know sort of what purpose generally they're working towards, whether or not that's just like learning a process or an actual final thing. But the process is what is most beneficial, as always, going back to the road trip thing, like the journey is the important thing, not the destination. And then evaluate, you have to think about what you actually did and get feedback on it and see if people like how they digested it, how they took your work, did it have the impact that you thought it was going to have? Did it align with what people are actually looking for? How did your peers feel about the experience? Were you a good team worker throughout the process? Kind of things. And then self-reflection papers too, what did you learn from the process of doing X, Y, or Z experiment? And then here are a couple questions, or I guess maybe I'll mention maybe 2 other things back on this slide. I have them up here. My memory was jogged looking at my notes, but some things I do in the classroom or in terms of like planning and preparing, thinking about the right book or the right text to give them, or the right thing to assign to kind of get them thinking, I think is very important. So the casebook that I use for environmental law is one that really focuses on case studies and employs this more experiential approach. Maybe more books are moving in that direction. And again, this can be very different discipline to discipline, but versus the books that are just like full of information and you just sit and read them and digest information. Mine is, it gives you sort of a little bit of background, and all the information comes from the materials that you have to read, which are real life cases and other materials, to then formulate an advocacy opinion and engage in the simulation. So the learning happens, it just in kind of a backwards form. So I've chosen a book specifically that does that because I think it engages the students more, and I notice that they're more interested in what it otherwise could be like a very dry topic. I also am going to start doing this walking class where I will lecture for, let's say the class is 2 hours. I'll lecture for 45 minutes. Then we'll go on a 45-minute walk approximately, and I'll give them a specific topic to discuss with a partner. And we'll walk kind of in a Madeline style line. And then we'll go around campus, just walking. There'll be, you have to stick with your partner, you have to stay in line. So you're kind of like put in this cylinder. Yeah, you're put into a row, like you can't deviate, you can't just like wander off over here. So I think that it forces you to kind of keep your focus on the topic of conversation. But I'm also curious, when we get back, they have to actually like engage substantively in whatever the topic of the lecture and specific questions I ask them to think about are. We'll get back, and then the partner has to talk about what their partner's perspective was. So they have to be thinking and listening and paying attention to what their partner was saying and really digesting it in order to relate it back to the class. And then after that, I ask, what else did you observe? And again, the observation should be related to whatever the lecture was. So if it's a lecture on like urban planning or biodiversity or something like that, they should be able to, I'll ask them like, what did you see when you were out there? Did you see, like, how many birds did you see? And maybe they won't have observed anything because they were so focused, but that kind of clues them into some other thoughts about like, the whole thing we were lecturing about was biodiversity and observation. And maybe you were looking for those things and you just didn't see them, which means we're in this urban environment that maybe has no birds, or maybe they're there and you just weren't seeing them because you were focused on something else. So, or maybe it gives you something interesting to say about what is biodiversity and can we have biodiversity in a very urban landscape. So again, just questions that sort of ask students to think a little more broadly about what the topic is, but within this kind of like structured pathway of conducting a 2-hour class. Okay, and then I put up a bunch of questions for discussion, but we can talk about anything else. I mean, sometimes people take the idea of experiential learning and the non-hierarchical aspect of it down to like, let's let students set the rules of engagement, right? How do you want to be evaluated? What's your baseline, and what can we measure growth from that baseline? Everybody's going to have a different baseline. Is that feasible as an instructor, or do we need to be the ones to set the rules and the guidelines versus letting students really kind of like set the parameters that they want to be judged by or evaluated by? Again, the question of like, can you even do this in a lecture class? I tend to think that it is possible, but a lot more difficult. The self-reflection papers, those kinds of things are possible, but in terms of like getting out there and engaging, I think it gets a little bit harder. I do like to ask students to like watch court proceedings or go to a courthouse and then sort of report back, but that's really done on their own time. I'm not really involved in it other than saying, go do this, observe what, see what you see, and then kind of report back and what did you learn in the process. And then I think like, how do we engage with campus? I think it's really, we have this like beautiful campus with tons of resources. I would love to know more about what's here, just to be able to take advantage of it, to engage my own students. And then again, every discipline is gonna have a different focus, but I'm really just curious, like, how you all think about experiential learning, what you can do, what you're already doing. So happy to kind of like leave it there and open it up for any kind of discussion here or online.
I'll say two things and then I have to.
Yeah.
Class. One is I'm taking my feature writing class to the state fair in a couple of weeks.
Oh.
And they're gonna be working in pairs. They can decide what kind of platform they're gonna do. Some people will do audio, some people will shoot photos. Some people will write. But the idea is to come up with a way to cover the fair, and we'll brainstorm this in class before we go.
Okay.
And then when we come back, we'll put together a multimedia package another day at the fair.
That's
Cool.
So, and what it's teaching them is, we've been hardcore on storytelling.
Yeah.
And I want them to see that you can tell stories all kinds of different ways.
Great.
So this is a way of pulling all those strings together and putting it onto one package.
That's so awesome. That's so cool.
So today we're doing.
I want to go on that field trip. That sounds awesome.
Once we just did food and I got so terribly sick, I would never eat my way through the fair again. Oh my God, the fried Oreos and the fried butter and the fried, I was like, oh, I'm sick. So, but yeah, so I'm a big fan of this.
Okay, that sounds
Huge fan.
really awesome. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay, yes, thank you.
I think that one interesting thing to plug is that we do have the Engage Dallas office on campus.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
And there's a lot of stuff that is place-based community engagement. And they already have relationships with people in the city of Dallas, that if you ever want to do, a class project or do something in your curriculum that has a partnership with some organization on campus, that they already some of these connections. We're helping kind of host a symposium, we'll just send out an invitation. So if you're interested in learning more and seeing what's already kind of there and seeing like it would be possible that they have a lot of connections to be able to do some of these things.
Yeah.
I'll be extremely curious to see how we could do something in math.
yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, people think of math as something so, abstract, but at the same time, I mean, we live in the world full of math, right? Like everything is here because of math. So I think, I mean, you can have creativity there, and if you make the connection to the real world, I think it makes it so much more special and memorable for the students.
Yeah.
So
It's harder because first of all, we need to be comfortable with the math language, to be able to speak that language. And it's different from the language we speak every day. And when you show a slide with a recipe on it, well, I had the resonance. It's similar to what I am teaching right now, algorithms. Yeah, it's like a recipe. What to do in step 1, 2, 3. But the difference is, the challenge is, in the algorithm that I am teaching, each step is not described using the language, English words we speak every day.
Sure.
It's described by mathematical symbols.
Okay.
So, and most students don't feel comfortable with those words. So they cannot understand the language. That's why it is challenging. It's challenging. You cannot read it. How can you cook, right? If you cannot read it.
Exactly.
So it's really challenging.
You're like even a more basic level that then read the recipe. It's like
learn the language.
It's
teaching them the ingredients for them to be able to.
Yeah, most of them do not feel comfortable with notation symbols, so they are struggling. Trying hard to think how can we improve? How can we make changes? It's really hard.
Yeah. I would love if you came on if I assigned you something, if you came on the Busch Garden tour and I was like,
what would you notice?
What would your contribution be? If I was like, tell me something about this that relates to math. I'm like so curious what the mathematical
Like how many
contribution would be.
how many paths do we have? How many branches do we have?
Okay,
Like this.
but even just like the relationships of the height of flowers to the, I don't know, maybe that's like physics or some other.
When do you go on the tour?
I have to be. I have a meeting at
The 10th.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Will you send us the information?
Do you want
It'll be
me
fun to
to-
go.
Oh, sure,
It'll be
yeah.
fun.
Yeah, like what the outcome was.
These are just fascinating, it gives me so much, I mean, everything I do is in a studio, so we're dancing, we're talking about the ideas and they're dancing, so it's like immediate learning outcomes, it's in the body,
Yeah.
right there.
Yeah.
But then I have them do these every 3 weeks, they have to do reflections.
Hmm.
And that's very interesting, because some of them, because they've all had different dance backgrounds, some of them can really physically articulate the ideas we're working, and some of them can't yet. But
Okay,
they can show me, at least in the written work, that they understand the concept, even if their own body isn't ready,
That's awesome.
able to do it clearly yet.
interesting,
So
okay.
that's interesting. And then this idea of the I just made some notes like whether that's a Zoom conversation with like I teach the perspective on ballet from this particular choreographer and teacher named George Balanchine, who founded the New York City Ballet. That's where I danced, and my whole background is in that particular lineage of ballet's family tree. So they're diving deep into that in the studio, and they have to do all this reading on their own about him and his life and his work and that. But maybe do like a Zoom conversation with like one of his former dancers, who's one of my friends or mentors. And then I thought about, I loved your idea of the walking and talking with a partner and thinking about like, you know, giving them a set combination and to work on it, but then like, as opposed to me giving the corrections. I did this once when I taught here before, but like after they did the step, then they had to have a partner like teach them like, okay, now you have to give the corrections about how to make the movement better to your fellow student. So you can do that.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
also thinking about the museum visit, like they have a midterm where they have to do a memorized class, like a small performance
Okay.
basically. But I thought maybe the session after that, we go to the Meadows Museum and just to look at the art and we talk about like what ideas, because I talk with them so much about ideas from the visual arts.
sure.
Like there's this whole, when you think about like, or like it's Super Perkins, like in the Old Testament, someone who is unwilling to learn and obstinate is called what? Stiff-necked. And if you saw a dancer like this, you don't have to know anything about ballet to know if there's something that looks off about that.
Yeah,
But if the neck is vulnerable,
right,
and it's like, that's all in visual art. So we could go look at like, these ideas are about beauty.
Yeah,
They're not-
absolutely.
they're
Make
not-
the connections, like,
And make the,
not
Totally.
even you telling them the connection,
No, but
but
just-
allow them to experience and see
Yeah.
the connection, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think that puts you in that vulnerable place, so that she's also a learner, right? Like they're in the garden, they're observing those things, they're talking about it, and
Right.
she's learning, she's part of that experience, which
yeah,
adds so much richness to the experience.
right.
Yeah, and much more memorable, right,
Yeah.
for the student than just you saying, okay, so if you see my leg and see this painting,
Right.
it's just like, it's just one more lecture.
but you can.
You can intuit that
Yeah.
by the learning you've already done.
Yeah.
In your own experience, you can see something feels off, but you don't know what it is, yeah.
But it's like maybe we've given them enough of the vocabulary this
Yeah,
semester, like, can you discern the difference?
Right.
Have you absorbed it deep enough that you could give the feedback to your fellow student?
Right.
Yeah.
Like if they fall out of the turn, can you give them the information in their body about how to get it back in balance?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
you're giving me so many, and I also thought the walking and talking is super like rabbinical. It's like Jesus walking along the side and he's teaching the people through, it's not like he sat them down in a lecture hall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's very like on the move.
Yeah.
And
And
it's
there's some good days
institute.
coming up, right? Like
I know, I was like waiting for it to get cooler.
Yeah, so there's some cool days coming, and that'll be the time, we have that one
Yeah.
week when
It's gonna be
it's
nice.
perfect weather.
I know, that's what we're gonna go on time, yeah.
Be ready for that window.
It's so cool.
Yeah, but it's- I mean, like the process of walking, just like your mind
Process stuff different.
is processing differently than when you're sitting and sedentary and like slouching and all of that, so. And when you were mentioning the museum, it made me think of, I was like last year or 2 years ago, there was this Instagram fad where people were taking famous paintings and they would dress up like
Oh,
the
yeah.
painting. Whatever, and like see how closely they could
Yes.
mirror it. It
Yes.
was sort of making me think about that,
Totally.
that thing.
Totally.
Which is another like thing you could do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They become the idea.
Yeah. Well, that's giving me ideas too.
Yeah, because of the idea, embody the idea.
Yeah, no, I love that.
This is so rich.
Well, thank you
Thank you
very
for taking the time
Thank
to
you so much.
synthesize all this.
Yeah, no.
People came in.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Super cool.
This was great to meet.
See